Hello again. Welcome to another edition of Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
Bob Anthony.
And I'm the guest and friend, Alan Singer.
This is being brought to you by the good graces of EVT Educational Productions, Zoom, and Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and we're taping the Wednesday before our Monday air. Dr. Singer, tell our viewers who you are and why you are guesting with us again.
Right. Thanks again, Bob and Eric, for having me. I'm an historian. I live in the city, but I teach at Hofstra University. And one of my areas of specialization is the history of race and racism in the United States. And right now in the United States, we're in the midst of a racist episode targeting Asian Americans. And I was very anxious to get involved in this discussion.
Glad you could make it, Alan. And yeah, that being said, let's just start off with the most recent assault attack. And it's more than an assault, it's an attack. And this shooter in Atlanta killed at least 8 Asian women, 10 people total. Bob, a little bit about him and what we know.
Well, basically, it was a totally out of the blue, unprovoked attack on multiple massage establishments in the Atlanta area. This young white man, and just on his own, I guess he had visited some of them before, goes in and shoots people inside. If you watch the video, he's as calm can be, exiting the car, doing his business and getting back in and driving away as if he just picked up a container of milk. So just an astounding massacre on a very, very soft target.
And 8 of the dead persons were Asian.
Six out of 8.
6 out of 8, okay.
But there was a number of very disturbing things here. First, that it was an attack on these Asian women. But second, the weaponry that exists in the United States, the absence of gun control is unheard of around the world. But the third thing is this young man is a religious fanatic, a Christian religious fanatic who's part of a Southern Baptist cult that preached that total abstinence from sex and that lust was a fundamental sin, a mortal sin. And so here is somebody who stereotypes Asian American women as exotic and submissive and takes out his sexual fantasies, which he believes will condemn him to hell anyway, by murdering them. And there are just a lot of very disturbing things that are going on in American society here.
And from what I heard, he felt that he was somehow removing temptation so that others would not be affected as well. That was sort of his kind of reasoning, which obviously is off the scale of lunacy.
I think these church groups should be held partly responsible because they have been preaching these really unhuman dictates. And then what we have is this kind of eruption.
Alan, that's an avenue that would take 10 different kind of shows to go down. So we're not going that route. But speaking of aberration and strangeness, the local sheriff who initially did the press conference on this guy basically half wrote it off as something akin to somebody having a bad day, which totally lit up all the whatever as well it should, because that was just a little too non-specific to the gravity of what this man had done. And then when it turned out that this chief had racist anti-Asian posts on his social media platforms, it spoke to the fact that, yeah, there's a deeper problem, not just this one young man.
Of course, it bothered me that anybody would try to humanize him that way, like he was just having a an awful, like you said, an awful day. We've seen this before. We've spoken about this before on this show about how some of these mass murderers, even by our own media, try to humanize them, try to give a little background as to what the hell he was doing when he did what he did. But the officer you're talking about, Eric, I believe was asked to leave the investigation based on his past anti-Asian social media posts, which I'm glad they did. But it just goes to show some of the, the issues in the law enforcement that tries to that addresses these problems.
Oh,
There, and it's
no,
in the.
this is almost like par for the course. You got pictures of police taking pictures with the Proud Boys in Philadelphia, taking pictures with the Proud Boys in the Capitol. And the Proud Boys are a basic domestic terrorist group. So this cozy relationship with cops and terrorists and cops and shooters, we've discussed it on Media Watch in the past. That young man out there in Kenosha comes from some little police academy training group for young would-be, wannabe law enforcement officers. So there are a lot of dynamics that are going into play on this. But what I really want to get into, as you so eloquently started on, Alan, is this long historical anti-Asian bias. And it's not always anti-Asian. If we get into the history properly, we can show this has been a push-pull in this country from its founding. The other and the not other, for whites only, and no, we got these aspirational principles. So let's deal with it from a perspective of how the Asians have fared historically.
Well, historically, Asians, and again, often it primarily targeted Chinese, were just seen as somehow alien. And during the age of imperialism, that difference, that alien culture, was used to justify European imperialism. And in the United States, it's been used to justify racism. And Asians have been attacked many times in the United States. In the 19th century, they were accused of being unfair labor competition. During World War II, Japanese Americans were incarcerated. They were accused of being a fifth column. And we're talking about US citizens were placed into camps because of who they were. More recently, they're being accused of unfair academic competition, or globally, Donald Trump stirred up tremendous hostility towards Asians and Chinese, accusing them of unfair economic competition, blaming them for the COVID virus, calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus. So we have a long history in the United States of really targeting Asians and stereotyping them. In 1882, they were the first group that were actually banned as immigrants into this country.
The Chinese.
Chinese, yes.
And continue, Alan. As you speak, I'm just going to bring up some old cartoons, historic cartoons that back up what you're saying. But please go ahead.
Well, the Chinese originally come to the United States in the 1840s as contract labor, unfree labor. And they're put to work in the most dangerous jobs, in mines, but also they're in the building of the Pacific Coast and the Transcontinental Railroad. They are working in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they're working in the Rocky Mountains. They're used by companies to break strikes. And because they're used by companies against workers, you start getting white workers and union workers becoming very hostile. And again, it's the pattern we always see of people being pitted against each other. Contract laborers are brought to the railroad sites. They're brought into the mines with armed guards. And if they attempt to leave, they are shot. And law enforcement accepts their murder because they're in violation of their contract. I compare what was done to the Chinese contract laborers, which were done on the chain gangs to African Americans after the end of slavery, where people are just forced labor, unfree, unpaid labor. And
so interestingly enough,
for the Chinese and the African Americans in these chain gangs, people were desperate.
Some of the cartoons Bob just popped up on the screen. There's physical violence in Wyoming in 1882, between 1882 and 1885, in that vicinity, because there was friction between white miners and Chinese miners. And the reports of 50 or more Chinese miners being killed. The reports are it's probably a lot more because people that disappeared were never heard of. Again, counting the bodies that they found, at least 50, but it could have been more because there are people who were there who were never heard from or seen afterwards. Around the same time in San Francisco, there were a couple of miners. That cartoon with the San Francisco workers in standing around with the no Chinese labor or something or other. That's one of the cartoons, graphics that you could bring up, Bob.
I'll try to bring up that particular one. I'll scroll back to that.
That particular one, that's the Seattle. That's a graphic of the Seattle riot that took place around the 1880s, between 82, 84. That massacre in Wyoming was around 82, 84. There was prior to that some stuff that took place in Los Angeles around 1871. And basically that graphic for the Los Angeles one was of the dead bodies of the Chinese that you saw photographed or documented after the rest. But that Columbia cartoon, that one right there, that was a reaction to the Wyoming, I believe the Wyoming massacre. And you've got Columbia protecting the Chinese laborer from the white mobs, the angry white mobs. And on the background, you can see all kinds of anti-Chinese rhetoric, importation of Chinese barbarians. The Chinese don't do X, Y, and Z. It's a 19th century thing. That Yellow Peril one, if you could bring that one back up, Bob, that's the one that I believe basically was the catch-all cartoon. I believe they called it the Yellow Terror in the cartoon, but William Randolph Hearst in his, quote, yellow journalism, as you guys were saying, from the newsprint, as opposed to from the assault on the Chinese, that particular one played into Remember the Maine and all that anti-Asian fervor that the Hearst newspapers were plugged into from the late 1890s.
This is the same stereotype that's used against African Americans, Eric, where the alien, different person, the racially different, is attacking white womanhood.
Well, there it is,
And
right
again,
there.
that was used against that. That stereotype was used repeatedly to other people. Look, one of the things in the 19th century, what we're looking at is employers using ethnic hostility towards the Chinese to divide the American working class, to break strikes. More recently, there's a different stereotype about Asians that has been used to divide ethnicities. So Asians, Japanese, Chinese, Koreans are being presented as the model minority, you know, the proof that anybody can make in American society. And that has been used as a cudgel to justify racism against Blacks and Latinos. So we're looking at a different phenomenon, but very much a parallel phenomenon. 19th century dividing workers, 21st century, 20th century dividing ethnic groups with different stereotypes.
That might otherwise work in tandem, work together, but obviously giving a reason not to, giving giving an excuse to separate and think of each other as the enemy, which we are not, obviously.
A very good
And
point, Bob.
Eric and I were speaking about this. You and I were speaking about this earlier, Eric, in the recent Black Lives Matter movement. After the George Floyd murder, we saw a lot of Asians in the march, backing. It was a rainbow, as you said, Eric, a rainbow coalition marching, and so the organizations, the other, of course, we know of the National Association of Black Journalists, the Asian journalists, Hispanics, Native Americans, LGBTQ journalists, all have our backs. And it's good to see that they're paying it forward in their support of the Stop Asian Hate movement.
Yeah, we've seen a number of rallies in the New York area and in cities across the country where people of all races and all persuasions pretty much have come out in support of Asians, because this rise in attacks and assault on Asians that seems to be increasing is something that we don't want to see, we don't want to support, and we want to let the Asian community know we have their backs, just like they had our backs during the summer of protests against all those police killings that took place across this country. But you're interesting, but you mentioned these coalitions that could form in Georgia. When those two senators got elected and Joe Biden turned that thing, thanks to Stacey Abrams, turned that state blue, there's a lot of Asians who came out and helped make that vote be what that vote is, okay? And so there's a reason why a lot of innate politicians who have been in power all these years by dividing these racial minorities against each other want to continue that. And now that they see that that weapon is going by the boards and people are coming together to vote, now they've started these voter suppression laws. And Georgia is the cradle and the poster child for these seriously voter suppression laws that are being passed in states across the country. And guess what? Alan, you were speaking about this earlier about the anti-gun legislation that can't get passed. Well, the anti-voter suppression legislation that can't get passed, even though the House has passed it. Talk to us a little bit about this For the People Act that's in Congress right now, that the House has passed, and what the odds are that the Senate might do anything with it.
Well, the Biden administration is in a difficult position, and it's going to have to act. If the Democrats are not able to deliver on their promises, they're going to lose their control of the House and Senate in 2022, and they risk losing the presidency in 2024. What the Republicans are trying to do is to block everything so that the Democrats appear ineffective. And the key is in the Senate, where there's a antiquated rule that 60% of the vote has to end debate. And the Democrats are going to have to say, we can't live with that rule any longer, because we need gun control, we need environmental legislation because of climate change, we need job programs, and we need voter defense programs. And we cannot allow a minority to block progress in the United States.
The filibuster, Bob, a little bit about that filibuster that Mitch McConnell was trying to defend the other day.
Well, I mean, with the filibuster, you're basically, I don't know the exact rules, but you basically, once you have the floor, you have the floor. And you can extend a discussion almost infinitely if you have the floor.
Yes, but guess what? They don't have the floor anymore. Tell us about how they phone it in.
You'll have to fill me. I'm not sure which angle you meant.
So Alan, correct me if I'm wrong. The old time filibuster, if you remember Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where Jimmy Stewart stood on the floor for 23 hours and made sure some bad
Furman.
Right. That was the original filibuster, the way it was instituted way back, whatever, supposedly. And you had to actually get into the well and talk. and discuss your point of view of why you thought that bill was not going to be good for the country, et cetera, et cetera. That's no longer in existence. And the behind the scenes rule about the filibuster, which they modified to that 60 vote thing so that they could actually end debate, was passed back in the day so that a lot of those anti-civil rights bills that the Democrats were trying to pass to get civil rights for minorities, the filibuster actually came into being so that the Dixiecrats could stymie those bills from being passed. And so the Democrats now need to change that, what do you call it, Alan, that antiquated rule? that whatever
The filibuster.
yes. So in order to pass any legislation.
Closure, to be able to close debate.
Yeah. So that's where we are right now. And to bring it back to the shootings, because we have, after Atlanta, we had 10 people killed in Colorado. And immediately the Republicans screaming because there was a hearing scheduled about gun control before the shooting. So when the shooting happened, the Republicans are screaming in the hearing, here go the Democrats again, trying to stamp on our Second Amendment rights and take our guns. This is what they're screaming a day after the day after the shooting, 10 people dead. And so they don't want to bring any gun control legislation to bear in the Congress. But guess what? The House has already passed 2 of those gun control measures. Now Mitch McConnell is not leading the Senate. So what's he going to try to do? Use the filibuster to stop this legislation. Alan, where do we go
The
from here?
Biden administration cannot permit it. If the Democrats allow McConnell to block environment, to block infrastructure, to block immigration, to block gun control, and to block voting rights, the Democratic Party is going to lose. And so whatever it takes to get positive government action, the Democrats have got to do. Biden has been smart so far. I have to hand him to that, but they cannot back off on this.
I'm afraid you're right, Alan. Barack Obama attempted to reach across the aisle and look for cooperation, and Biden basically knows he's not going to get that. So it's got to be done, and it's got to be done with the heavy hand that he really wasn't looking forward to wielding. And like you said, if the Democrats are stymied on those initiatives, what will that tell the voters in 2022 and 2024 that the Democrats didn't do anything? So that is the big danger. I'm stunned that the stimulus went through. They had to heavy hand that. That's the way they're going to have to handle this.
Yep.
It's not the greatest way to run a government, but that's the way it has to be with Mitch McConnell, the Rand Pauls, and the Ted Cruz's running around.
And the Ron Johnsons
and that's even worse. Ron Johnson out of Wisconsin. He's bucking for crackpot number 1.
Yeah,
there's a lot of competition for crackpot number 1.
Yes.
those are crazy Republicans. What worries me is the fact that you have Democrats like Joe Manchin and Sinema, whatever her name is, in the Senate, who should be trying to get the Democrats' agenda for the people, that Voting Rights Reform Act, the For the People Act, the John Lewis is the nickname, John Lewis's Voting Rights Act. They should be 100% behind that, or 100% behind modifying the filibuster so this legislation can get through. Joe Manchin is talking about he's not about to be fixing the filibuster, and Sinema is also on his camp. These are Democrats that can't afford to be siding with Republicans on these type issues because it's a 50-50 Senate. The only way the Democrats win is if the vice president comes in and breaks the tie. So what are Biden and Harris going to do to get these bills through if you got recalcitrant Democrats like Manchin and Sinema? I know it's a hard question.
Yeah, very hard question.
And we have about 3 minutes. But yeah, yeah. That's an understatement.
Yeah,
It being
okay.
a hard
All
question.
right.
Basically,
Well,
they're gonna have to bribe them.
We
They're gonna
throw it
have to
out there.
offer them something they want and they need.
All right.
So West Virginia is desperate for jobs. And what he's gonna have to do is offer job programs for West Virginia to get everything else through. Arizona, she needs Latino votes to stay in office. So they're going to have to work out a deal with her on DACA and immigration policy. So that's, Biden knows, that's what politicians do. They horse trade. And they're going to say to the guy from West Virginia, we're going to give you the jobs. We need the package. And they're going to say to the woman in Arizona, we're going to give you the Latino vote, but we need the package.
Okay.
That's what's going to, that's historically what's going to happen.
As my grandmother would say, from your mouth to God's ears.
I keep explaining it to him. I don't know if he listens.
Let's hope something like that happens.
Oh,
In
Eric, I want to introduce one other thing. I should have raised it earlier. The New York Times had a series this week that was incredible. What the Times has been doing, it's been looking at the video that individuals and news sources took at the Black Lives Matter demonstrations last summer.
Mhm,
And it's been focusing on police behavior.
mhm.
And with the basically, I think they had over 60 videos. And what they said, and they didn't want to say the word, but what they showed was a police riot. Police were rioting in the street of New York, systematically beating up demonstrators who weren't doing anything, or maybe they were out after the curfew, over and over again.
So this was just New York videos or videos?
These were just New York videos, though the same thing was going on all over the country.
Interesting.
Okay, and we have about 45 seconds.
So,
And I just thought that had to be stated.
I'm glad you that's something we need to dig into and
Yes.
compare that with the rest of the country, because that's crucial into talking about, quote, defunding the police. Everybody wants to get caught up in that term. We can get into what that term really means. It's not about stopping policing. It's about reforming policing by changing the monetary focus. And I think with that, we're out of time.
Yes.
This has been Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
I'm Bob Anthony. Catch up to us on Twitter and YouTube at Media Watch EVT.
And I'm Alan Singer. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Singer, for joining us, and we'll catch you the next time, folks. Stay safe in the time of COVID.